Welcome to the Teach Joyfully podcast, where we talk about all things elementary teaching with some mom stuff thrown in. I'm Lisa Burns, a teacher success coach, veteran elementary teacher, and mom of 5. I'll be your host. Thanks for joining me. Something I teach from early on, yes, even in kindergarten, is how to analyze a text and use evidence when talking about a text and citing your answer. I know that seems really huge even in kindergarten, much less in 5th grade, but in the elementary grades, it's not something we could ignore, and it's not something you have to do in a written format all the time, especially with the primary grades. It can be done orally during your read aloud. I think it's really important. It sets kids up for success in the upper elementary grades and on into middle school and high school. It is not beyond the realm of their ability. It is not. I think so often we dumb down what we're teaching and don't challenge kids to do things that they actually really can do. And this is something they actually can do. And not only can they do it, they love doing it because honestly, they love being detectives. And that's all this is. I talk about being a story detective and having the students be able to analyze the story with evidence, just like a detective would, is really fun. So let's get started. Let's start with what is textual, what is analyzing a text or textual analysis. Textual analysis is studying the evidence that's in the story or the text to understand its meaning. Evidence in a text is information in the text that backs up what it is that you're thinking about the text. So whatever it is that you're thinking, you're backing it up with evidence. And so evidence would be facts and information that prove your point. I guess one of the first things we need to talk about is why should you analyze a text? Well, you should analyze a text in order to understand something, to discuss it, to interpret it. All of these are ways that we get a deeper understanding and comprehension of what it is that we're reading. So I think textual analysis and finding evidence are essential skills for readers to be not only good readers, but to really enjoy reading and to get the most out of what they read. There's two kinds of evidence in a text. There's the obvious evidence, the explicit evidence that is plainly stated. It's just right out there and says, this is it. That's the easy stuff. Anyone can find that. And it's important. It needs to be there. Maybe the author comes right out and says, my dad was really annoyed with me. Well, okay, so now we know dad's not happy, right? That's pretty obvious because it was stated directly. But implicit evidence is something that we have to dig for. It's something that we have to be serious detectives and we have to go in and figure it out because it's not obvious. It's implied. It's there in the text. It's right there for us to pluck it out and use it, but we have to actually dig a little bit for it. We have to think a little bit for it. It's not obvious. You have to figure it out based on what the author is suggesting and pull it out of that piece instead of it having it just lying on the ground like an Easter egg. So explicit evidence might be, my friend and I were fighting and she was really upset. Might be that my friend and I were fighting and she was really angry with me. Or implicit evidence might be, I walked into the room and my friend Mary ignored me. She didn't say a word as I walked past, and I did the same. Okay, so they aren't saying we're fighting, but you can tell they're not happy with each other and they're not speaking to each other because one, we stated that they're friends, and two, they're ignoring each other. So now we can pull that piece out and say, what's going on here? Another thing that happens in children's stories a lot, it might be that there's snow on the ground and they don't tell you what season it is, but can you tell? Yes, well, there's snow on the ground. It's cold outside. They can give you all the clues without saying that it's winter. So there's lots of ways that authors use this without being quite so obvious. Honestly, as a writer and as a reader, it's so much more interesting than it is to have the author tell you everything. If the author explicitly tells you everything, it's pretty darn boring. So there's a word that we use when we teach children this kind of evidence, and we call it inferring or inferences. And that is a conclusion that we're drawing based on evidence and our reasoning as we look at the story. So here's an example of how I might use a picture book to teach this in the classroom. So in Cynthia Ryland's book, The Relatives Came, there are relatives that are traveling to see a family, and they drive through the night and they finally get there. And then, of course, there's all that hugging and everything else as everybody's so excited to see each other. Okay, so then after that, there comes to this passage, and I want to read this passage to you and show you how I would use this. So then it says, Then it was into the house, and so much laughing and shining faces and hugging in the doorways. You'd have to go through at least 4 different hugs to get from the kitchen to the front room. Those relatives. Now, you can just picture that to begin with, but also if I were reading this book, one of the things I do with this book is I do not show students the pictures on the first read, because Cynthia Ryland does such a great job with her language, but the pictures are very expressive too, and it gives away some of the things I want to talk about before I'm ready for students to hear that. So on the second read, they get the pictures, but on the first read, I want them to imagine it in their head and be detective. I might say, all right, friends, I want you to put on your detective hat and your detective ears, and we're going to listen to what the author is telling us to try and figure out a couple of things. So I would read the passage, and then after I read the passage, I would say, now, wait a minute, are the relatives all glad to see each other? Because the author doesn't tell us that. The author doesn't say, oh, we are so excited to see everybody. Well, my students always say, well, yes, they're excited to see each other. And I ask them, well, how do you know that? And so they would go back to this passage and tell me, well, there was laughing, there was shining faces, and there was hugging in the doorways. Well, you're not laughing and smiling and hugging people in the doorways if you're not happy to see them. That's very obvious once you pull those pieces of evidence out. Then I ask students, okay, so are there a lot of people in the house? Is the house crowded, or is it just a few people came to visit? And it's easy to pull out because the author doesn't tell us this, but it's easy to pull out. Students will go back and say, well, yes, it's crowded. They had to go through 4 different hugs to get from the kitchen to the front room. So it's very crowded. These are simple ways to teach inferencing to students. They get it. Students understand what this is like. They can get a mental picture in their heads because Cynthia Ryland's words are so expressive, and they understand. Even kindergartners are able to pull this information from the text once they have a little bit of guidance and training. And let me tell you, once you do it a few times, they become fantastic at it. So I highly recommend that you try this. Don't avoid inferencing even with kindergartners, because really truly, not only can they do it, they love doing it. It is so much fun. Don't worry, I have a book list to help get you started. There are wonderful books that you can use, picture books that will help you in teaching implicit and explicit evidence and inferencing to your students. They'll have a great time with these books, and you will too. So that's it, my teacher friends. We're out of time and I'm out of breath. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you liked today's episode, I'd love it if you'd go to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen and leave a review. And while you're there, hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss an episode. Also, you can continue the conversation online with me in my Facebook group, the Teach Joyfully Podcast Community, where elementary teachers can connect, get help, and encouragement for all kinds of education and parenting topics. You can find the show notes and links to all the resources mentioned in today's episode on my website at www.hopeineducation.com/podcast. And remember, a happy teacher is a good teacher. So until next time, teach joyfully and take care of you.